What's crackin', people? I am the Designated Roller, and this is the first episode of What's Good. The goal with this series is to throw my thoughts on a subject into the aether and create a discussion about it with you guys. I like to think of it as the table where critical thinking, banter, and shitposting can all break bread in harmony, you know? So with that in mind, today we're going to be talking about what's good with World of Warcraft's Legion expansion. World of Warcraft holds the crown for devouring the most hours of my life out of any MMO that I've played, and thankfully, maybe, Legion has made it relevant again. I think WoW is actually a great game to jumpstart this series with because it's in a really good place right now, but it still hasn't quite shed a lot of the more stale and frustrating aspects of MMOs, and I think that'll make for some interesting discussion. So let's get into it. So Legion has done a great job of breathing new life into the game. The class revamps have made gameplay a lot more enjoyable and visually engaging, and the questing and story while leveling to 110 were top-notch, arguably the best of any of WoW's expansions so far, in my personal opinion at least. Blizzard added in profession quests as well as a full-blown secondary story campaign for each individual class, which really does contribute to the feeling of class choice actually mattering and adds some variety when leveling alts, which is always nice. I really enjoyed getting to 110 on my enhancement shaman. The zones are all visually distinct, and while the quests didn't break the mold in most cases, they weren't overly samey. Progression via artifact weapon traits didn't really allow for a lot of diversity, but the feel of powering up the weapon was enjoyable enough for me to forgive the lack of any additional talent choices on the path to 110. The initial process of getting geared up by running dungeons, advancing the Suramar storyline, and doing world quests was pretty fun initially, and for some reason I also enjoyed the fuck out of fishing this time around for reasons I cannot begin to comprehend, but for me the endgame unfortunately is where things kind of fell apart this time around. So I feel like Blizzard really thought that they were innovating with the whole legendary system and world quests and Mythic Plus. I really do. I just don't think that they understood that players have pierced the veil on this shit after more than 20 years of MMOs being a thing. A grind is a grind is a grind, no matter how you dress it, and RNG is never going to be a rewarding foundation upon which to build progression. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here though, so let me back up for a second. World quests and Mythic Plus dungeons in their current incarnations get repetitive fast. I do love that Blizzard takes this incestuous approach to migrating good systems between their games, and it seems to pay off pretty well for them usually. Like the weekly brawls in Overwatch by way of Hearthstone are a good example of this sort of thing working out. Problem is, these systems were plucked from Diablo, and Diablo and WoW incentivize very differently and are consumed in different portion sizes time-wise, so to speak. The analog to world quests in Diablo work because they're done in a few minutes, every kill has a chance of dropping an upgrade as well as materials that you need in abundance, and there's a bit of procedural generation thrown in just to give a bit of variety. In WoW, where gear upgrades come primarily from focused efforts made by a group post item level 830-ish at least, world quests become a case of finding the 4 that are least annoying in a given zone so that you can get your disappointment box from the emissary dailies. Zipping around all over the place just to get a daily crack at not getting a legendary is a far cry from the constant opportunities for progression that you get from the Diablo equivalent. To top it off, if you happen to want to play solo for whatever reason for however long, they are pretty much going to be your only progression path gear-wise. Now, I'm not a big dungeon grind kind of guy, so I haven't gotten into the Mythic Plus side of things yet, but from what I've gathered from watching streams and comments on Reddit, it seems as though the Mythic Plus system has its own problems as well. On paper, there's an obvious disconnect between WoW's implementation of this system and the greater rifts in Diablo 3 that inspired it. If you're pushing greater rifts in Diablo, you're on a different map almost every time fighting different enemies. You're aiming to be done in less than 10 minutes, and you can do it solo or with a group of any size, really. If you're pushing Mythic Plus dungeons, you're doing the same damn dungeon over and over again a lot of the time. You're locked in for 20 to 30 minutes every time, and you need to have a full group that is geared and competent and ideally on voice comms. It's a much more invested experience, and while I'm sure it has its fans, what it doesn't have is enough variety to avoid becoming just another grind, especially once you hit a point where there's no longer a realistic gear incentive to keep you going. Finally, there's the RNG side of things. Warforging, Titan Forging, and Legendaries all just make gear progression into a giant messy shit show of dice rolls. I don't even know what to say about this, to be honest. Legendaries could have been the coolest and most rewarding progression pieces in the game, but instead there's something you might get out of a box or chest after doing the exact same shit that you already did a few hundred times before. As far as RNG item level upgrades, who could have thought that it was a good idea to hand out ass-tier gear with a chance to upgrade into something maybe usable? I get that they had Diablo designers on board here, really I do, but it seems like there was very little critical thinking applied to translating this kind of system from one game to the other. See, in D3, you get constant opportunities at these upgrades. In WoW, those opportunities are both more scarce and finite. Before I get into my overall thoughts about Legion, I just want to touch on one last thing about the whole D3 WoW crossover episode aspect of Legion. Diablo 3 is a game with seasons, and about midway through those seasons, even the most competitive players are usually ready to drop dead with boredom, and general interest in the game from both spectators and players dwindles drastically. Without seasonal resets, a little bit of patch content wouldn't be nearly enough to sustain the long-term interest of most players. So what am I getting at with all of this? Well, simply put, why would you implement mechanics that barely float a game that has to hit the reset button every few months to keep people interested into a game where semi-permanent character progression is the primary incentive? I just can't understand the logic behind it, at least not in its current implementation, and I really hope that Blizzard takes some time to revisit these systems and smooth them into something a little bit more suited to the kind of game that WoW actually is. So with that out of the way, let's talk big picture. I've been ignoring raiding and PvP up until now because I don't have any experience with nor intention of participating in them myself this expansion, so I don't really have much of an opinion on them subjectively speaking. I'm not really sure how that meshes with my feeling that they're probably going to end up being the best things about this expansion, but here we are. Raiding seems to be in a really good place this expansion, and while I've heard mixed feedback about Emerald Nightmare, it's definitely trended more towards the positive side of things. And with Nighthold coming in early 2017, it seems like raiders have a lot of content to look forward to. On the PvP side of things, with stat equalization, honor talents, prestiging, and the devs being able to balance PvP independently from PvE, this is looking like one of the best possible expansions for players who want to spend their time in Azeroth murdering each other. Remember too, that's on top of the class revamps, which have already made combat feel more responsive. It feels like a good time to be a PvPer. I've only done a few battlegrounds as Enhancement Shaman, but I've gotta say, it's the best PvP combat has felt to me since sweet, sweet nostalgia-tinted vanilla. Now, this being early days for Legion, I'm sure the balance is probably less than ideal, but long term, I think we're going to see Legion become the most balanced era of PvP that the game has ever seen. At the very least, it has that potential thanks to the new balancing system that they've implemented. So bearing in mind that I believe raiding and PvP are going to be the two pillars of this expansion, thankfully for Blizzard, PvP really only requires balance updates to stay alive, so that means that they can put most of their focus on creating quality PvE content. The bad news, potentially at least, is that a lot of players who returned for Legion did so as a one last chance kind of thing. Warlords of Draenor and Mists of Pandaria were stopping points for a load of previously loyal WoW players, myself included, and Legion was what brought us back into the fold. That is pretty much the definition of a faith statement right there. If Blizzard wants this to be more than just WoW's last hurrah, they're going to have to keep us interested and prevent burnout and sort of validate the faith that we've placed in them. And that's no small task. The good news, however, is that Legion is an excellent foundation for them to build upon. With regular content drops and a few tweaks to existing systems, I think that Legion could end up being exactly what WoW needed to keep it alive. I feel like the next 6 months will either make or break this expansion, so here's to hoping that Blizzard stays sharp and hungry for that sub revenue. And that, my friends, is what's good with World of Warcraft Legion. What's good with you folks, though? Do you have any thoughts on Legion? Ideas for where they should take the content over the next few months? Anything like that? If so, hit me up in the comments, or you can get at me on Twitter at DSGNTDRLLR. That's Designated Roller with just the consonants, because I can't afford to buy a vowel, you feel me? The struggle's real out here. If you liked the video, like the video, and if you thought it was ass, there's a button for that too. If you're new around here, hit the subscribe button for more of my nonsense delivered straight to your sub feed. And if you want to come chat and watch me fail at video games live, make sure to follow me over at twitch.tv/DesignatedRoller. All the links are in the description below because, honestly, who wants to type things? That's all for me, folks. Much love to each and every one of you beautiful savages, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay black.